Pablo sat on the old sofa, wrapped in a shabby plaid. Outside the window, the rain rumbled, and the dim light from the lamp stretched across his face, reflecting fatigue and something more a vague, hazy uneasiness. He was unable to figure out what exactly was troubling him, but the feeling of strange weariness wouldn't let go. "Sister," Pablo said the word with a sort of confident and easy smile. "Sister." It was always obvious, wasn't it? It was as if he had asked the question to himself, and just the echo of his own words sent a slight chill running through him. His gaze seemed to be detached, but if anyone was around right now, they would have noticed him searching the empty space of the room for an answer. Pablo had always considered his relationship with his sister to be the easiest and most natural. They had grown up together. Laughter, arguments, secret games, helping each other in times of need, it was all part of their unbreakable bond. And now he was sitting here, almost in the dark, wondering why this strange, irrepressible discomfort was suddenly appearing. It was so obvious, wasn't it? Pablo took his mind off his thoughts for a moment and picked up his coffee cup. It was scalding. He brought it to his lips, tasting the strong, bitter liquid, which now seemed to him a strange comfort. But the thoughts wouldn't let go. Sister. She had always been there for him, and he couldn't understand when exactly something had changed in their relationship. So what if everything was so obvious? And how many things are actually hidden behind familiar phrases? Sister, of course, sister. She and I are as one, aren't we? Pablo repeated, as if to convince himself of this. He remembered how they had laughed with her, shared secrets and made up fantastic bedtime stories. They knew each other like no one else. It seemed like their bond was something unshakable. But right there, in the middle of a rainy night, a thought suddenly struck him that he immediately pushed away. Was she really his sister? Yes, she was his sister. Or was she not? Suddenly, phrases he'd heard over the past couple weeks flashed through his mind. It was a random phrase from his parents, unremarkable at first glance, but suddenly now it resonated in his mind as something more important. "It's not like you haven't seen her since you were a kid," his father had said casually one day when they were discussing family photos. He didn't know what to make of that. He'd let it pass. And now it was starting to seem strange. Why had his father said it that way? Why had the phrase not immediately stayed in the past, but suddenly came back to his memory at this moment? Here was his mother, who had once mentioned in a conversation with his sister that she was a lot like her mother. Sure, it could have just been words, but damn, something still didn't feel right. It's the little details, but they kind of fall out of the big picture like a cog in the wheel that doesn't spin like all the others. Pablo leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes, trying to push the intrusive thoughts away. He knew his parents were good people. That they had always taken care of him and his sister. Everything in their house had always been perfect, the coziness, the warm atmosphere. But why, now that he was just sitting here, did it suddenly begin to feel like his life had been deprived of something important? Why was there an emptiness in his soul that he couldn't understand? He opened his eyes and brushed his hand across his forehead as if trying to wipe away these thoughts. The words, sister to sister, brother to brother, rang in his head again. Why then, had there never been a moment in his memory when he'd actually realized that he and his sister were not just siblings but something more? Why was there no such, that very realization when a person suddenly catches the gaze of another and something in him clicks, and you begin to realize that this person is like a part of you? They didn't have that. But why? Pablo pulled out his phone and looked at the old pictures. There were too many memories. He leafed through the tapes and each picture of him and his sister seemed special. But there was something in their poses and her gaze. That feeling came just now. Something wasn't right. He held his gaze for a moment on one photo, where he and his sister were smiling against a green park, but something flashed in his sister's eyes for a second, something he couldn't explain. More than just a smile. It was as if her face had changed for a few milliseconds. But Pablo himself was too busy to notice such details. Then he did something he didn't want to do. He started looking for other pictures. The ones that showed their family even younger. They were scattered all over the apartment, on the walls, on shelves. He saw that moment when they were very young. His sister looked almost like a stranger. A strange sensation swept over him. And then he noticed something even stranger. Her look, her posture in that picture. She looked nothing like the girl he knew. He stood in front of that picture and something inside him began to click. There didn't seem to be anything that could explain his condition. Pablo sighed and scratched the back of his head. This time the thought wouldn't leave him. He couldn't take it into his head. He gave it a moment's hesitation. He was sure his sister was his sister, but in that moment, he was beginning to doubt it. Who was she really? Why had he ignored what he'd seen in those pictures all these years? Why now when it seemed so clear? Pablo couldn't get that moment with the photograph out of his mind. The more he thought about it, the more it didn't fit in his head. He sat on the couch, going through the photos, trying to find anything that would confirm that everything he'd felt was just a play of imagination. But it wouldn't go away. Every once in a while he'd let his gaze drift to old family photos, trying to see the genuine joy that used to be in them. But each time his gaze was more wary, more analyzing. He remembered his father sitting with him in the kitchen a few days ago. Everything had seemed so simple. A cup of coffee, a quiet conversation about life, about how Pablo was doing. But suddenly his father said a phrase that sent a chill down Pablo's spine. "You know, we've always told you that your sister is just like everyone else. But I can't help but notice that you have her changing strangely." Pablo had dismissed it, saying that old age was taking its toll and that it was all just a misunderstanding. But now, remembering that moment, everything disturbed him. The tone, the expression on his father's face, his slight confusion, which seemed utterly ridiculous. Why had he said strangely changing? It was completely out of his father's style, who always spoke directly and without innuendo. Pablo sensed that there was something more lurking beneath it, but as always he chose not to go any deeper. Now that he remembered it, it was too late, everything was no longer so obvious. Pablo began to notice oddities in other people's behavior as well. He had met his childhood friend Luis the night it all started. Luis had always been the one who knew about all the little things, knew their family, their little secrets. But in that moment something had changed. Luis was talking to him as usual, but his gaze was somehow too quick, as if he wasn't seeing Pablo directly in his eyes, but trying to avoid his gaze. In response to a question about his sister, Luis somehow very tentatively replied that she was always strange. Pablo didn't know how to respond. He tried to turn the conversation to another topic, but the feeling of strange unease never left him. Why the hell was his friend suddenly so cold? It all accumulated in his head like a lump that could not be thrown away. But Pablo could not understand what was troubling him. All these questions, all these inconsistencies seemed trifles, and yet they still did not give him peace. Several days passed. Pablo continued to revisit the photographs. He noticed another strange detail. In many of them, his sister, as if for real, looked alien. It wasn't just a small thing but something more. There was something in her eyes at times that didn't match the image of the carefree girl he'd grown up with. In one of the pictures of her and her sister playing at the cottage, she wasn't smiling. It wasn't just tiredness or a lack of mood. It was an emptiness in her eyes, strange, cold. The moment Pablo saw that picture, he had a feeling that she wasn't the girl he had shared his childhood with. "What does it mean?" Pablo whispered, going through the pictures. He couldn't figure out when it had started. It had been a long time ago. And yet, the feeling that his life might be something different than he used to think was becoming a reality. At night, when Pablo couldn't sleep, he decided to talk to his mother after all. Maybe she would give some answers. He had long felt that there was something in their home that he wasn't being told. She'd always been kind and caring, but sometimes there were odd moments in her behavior. A slight strain in her voice when she started talking about her sister, a look he couldn't decipher. It was like a subtle patina of anxiety that was too slight to be noticed but too persistent to ignore. When Pablo asked her a direct question, suddenly she was silent for a moment. It was so unexpected that Pablo didn't even know how to react. His mother looked at him, and her eyes were full of something unspeakable. She smiled as always, but that smile was strange. "Do you think it's always been like this? Are you sure your sister is what you think she is?" she said in a soft, slightly trembling voice. "What do you mean?" Pablo felt the blood run cold in his veins. Everything in his body literally clenched at that phrase. He tried to understand what she meant. It wasn't just a question, it was more than that. "Pablo, you've always been so sure of your parentage. But what if there's something you don't understand?" she added with a deep sigh. His mother looked away. Something flashed in her eyes that Pablo had never noticed before. He couldn't understand what it was. He left the house feeling like an invisible storm was shaking his world, and he didn't know what to do about it. Pablo felt like he was losing ground beneath his feet. People who had always been there for him began to act as if they were hiding something. Everything started to feel strange. And this strangeness wasn't just anxiety, it was something deeper. His own family seemed to start moving in some unknown direction. He returned home and began to revisit the pictures again. This time, instead of looking for evidence that everything was as he had always known it was, he started looking for something else. He looked at the photos with new eyes. And lo and behold, in one of them, his gaze fell on something he hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the photo, against an old oak tree, Pablo noticed a man who seemed completely out of place in their family circle. He was sort of in the background, but his presence left no doubt. It was a man who shouldn't have been there. It was someone foreign, but Pablo couldn't understand where he had come from in their picture. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a mystery. And the more Pablo tried to figure it out, the more questions arose. Pablo was obsessed. He would wake up at night, get out of bed, turn off the light, go to the old photographs, poring over them like maps that now seemed to lead him to an unknown abyss. He couldn't let himself calm down, but everything was like a nightmare with no exits in sight. He kept digging because he didn't know what else to do. There were more and more questions in his head that needed answers. He dialed his father's number again and waited a long time before the receiver picked up. "Dad, I need to talk to you. You remember those old pictures, don't you?" Pablo started with the simplest of things, trying not to sound pushy. The father on the other end of the line sighed heavily, and there was a strange, strained note in his voice. It wasn't like their usual conversations. "I've told you everything, Pablo. Why are you suddenly so hung up on this? We're all family, you know." His father's voice trembled slightly, but Pablo didn't hear it. His thoughts were occupied with something else. "It's not just memories, Dad. There are things I can't understand. Do you remember that picture from the summer house? The one of me and my sister playing ball? You saw that something was wrong there?" Pablo tried to be soft, but the tension in his voice was becoming more and more palpable. My father sighed again, and this time there was something almost painful in his tone. "You think too much, son. I don't know why you brought all this up, but don't. You better forget it, you understand? It's not your concern." Pablo felt a hot wave of irritation rising in his chest. It wasn't just an answer, it was an excuse. He knew his father had avoided the subject. He sensed that on the other end of the wire his father was trying to keep quiet, to hide something he probably didn't even realize himself. "Wait, Dad, can you hear me? I'm not an idiot. Everything you say sounds like empty excuses." Pablo couldn't hold back any longer. "What kind of secrets are you keeping? Why do you say not my concern? I'm your son." But there was silence on the other end. Pablo felt something crunch inside, and before he could add anything, his father interrupted the conversation. "You figured it out for yourself?" His voice became harsh and cold. "Don't call me again." The receiver rang and Pablo stood leaning against the wall. It was as if a new wave of doubt was pumping through his head, and his heart was beating frantically. He looked at the pictures again. They gave him no peace of mind, like warnings, like something dangerous. His certainty of kinship began to melt like an ice crust, disappearing into the void. But he couldn't give up. It would be too easy. He knew something was hidden from him, and it was his duty to track down the truth. The next day he met with Luis, a childhood friend who had always been there for him when Pablo needed to solve something. He thought Luis would be able to help, that maybe he could shed some light on what was hidden. But his meeting with Luis didn't bring relief either. "Look, Luis, I can't keep quiet anymore. This isn't just a game. You've seen these pictures, right? You know there's something wrong with your sister. I'm not the only one who noticed, it's obvious to everyone." Pablo started the conversation with what seemed obvious. Luis looked confused, as if he hadn't been prepared for Pablo to speak so frankly about his doubts. He kept trying to avoid answering, deflecting the conversation as if he didn't know what to do. "You may be picking on me too much, Pablo." Luis coughed and looked away. "I remember those pictures too. But you shouldn't do that. Believe in the best, forget about it." Pablo became wary. Why were they all starting to react like this? He couldn't understand what was happening to his friend. It was like some kind of mystery to be solved, and Luis could be a part of it. But Luis didn't want to explain anything. "Why do you say that? You know that if there's a secret, you have to reveal it. What is everyone hiding from me? Why is everyone so afraid of the truth?" Luis replied curtly. "It's just, Pablo, don't look for what isn't there. People change, and you have to realize that sometimes it's better to leave things as they are." His words sounded unconvincing. This was not the Luis that Pablo had grown up with. It was as if someone had replaced him, and the Luis that had always been there for him was gone. It was strange, frightening. Pablo realized that something was wrong, that Luis was hiding something. But he didn't know what to do next. Pablo started looking for more clues. He looked into family documents, rummaged through old papers, corresponding with people from the past he hadn't thought about in so long. But each new attempt to find out the truth brought him to a dead end. Instead of realizing something, he was confronted with more inconsistencies. One day he turned to an old family friend, Carlos, who was a fairly close friend of Pablo's parents. He figured Carlos might be able to tell him something that others weren't telling him. But as soon as he started asking questions, Carlos started acting even stranger. "Carlos, do you remember when I was born? You were at my baptism, you saw me then." Pablo started the conversation with what always seemed natural. Carlos hesitated a moment, then said with a wary smile. Of course I remember. You were such a baby, so small. But Pablo, you must realize that things are not what you think they are. Sometimes the memory deceives you. What do you want to hear? It was a strange phrase, a strange reaction, and Pablo sensed that Carlos was hiding something. Something wrong with his answer, something wrong with the way he spoke. Pablo felt it all starting to come down on him like a snowball that was picking up speed, and he felt more and more like his life was just a big lie. How many other people knew more than he did? How many more secrets were hidden in front of him? He got home and started flipping through old photos again. Finally, when he looked at the one on the most visible shelf, he saw it, his sister standing next to him, but this time her eyes looked different. It wasn't his sister's face. It was something alien, unnatural. And in that moment he felt that everything that seemed true was a lie. Pablo couldn't wait any longer. He didn't know what exactly he would find in his conversation with his sister, but one thought kept him going. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. How many years they had lived together, sharing every little detail, every moment of life, but now there was something strange about their relationship, something that kept him on edge. She was part of him, part of his world, and if she knew more than he did, she could dispel the fog. But what if she was just as confused as he was? He called her, not knowing how to start the conversation. After everything that had happened, how do you bring it up? How do you say something you don't want to hear? But he couldn't keep quiet. He knew that if he didn't ask now, he would suffer even more. Elvira, can we talk? Pablo said, trying to hide the anxiety in his voice. His sister hesitated a little but responded quickly. Of course, Pablo. What is it about? You're worrying about the smallest things again, aren't you? Her voice was light, but Pablo sensed that there was something lacking sincerity in it. He took a deep breath and said resolutely, You know I can't find peace, don't you? You and I grew up together and now I don't understand what's going on. Why am I starting to doubt that we are really brother and sister? The sister fell silent again. For a second Pablo thought she was going to hang up, but she stayed on the line. Are you out of your mind? You've always had confidence in us. Her voice became more cold, as if she was trying to hide her confusion. But then why do I feel like something is hiding from me? Why is that confidence suddenly gone, and why are you acting like this is all a game? Elvira, I need to know the truth. You know something, I can feel it, Pablo said, feeling each word come out with an effort. His sister didn't seem to expect such an onslaught. She coughed nervously and replied, Pablo, are you crazy? You and I have always been close, you were my friend. We told each other everything, didn't we? So stop it. You can comfort yourself, it doesn't matter. There's no point in looking for something that isn't there. Her words, soft but so decisive, made Pablo even more doubtful. She tried not to answer directly to deflect the question, but that only confirmed that there was more behind her words. Pablo felt the tension building in his chest, and all his doubts began to grow into something more than mere anxiety. You're afraid, aren't you? Afraid that if I find out the truth, everything will change? He couldn't stop, he could feel every word he said rising to the surface like something pressing that gave him the strength to take the next step. I'm not afraid. I just don't understand why you're acting so strange. You remember how it was? Her voice trembled and Pablo felt that tension again, like a cold fog that wrapped around his thoughts. She tried to hold herself together, but she couldn't hide her anxiety. Elvira, I don't need lies. I don't need you to turn a blind eye to what is obvious. What are our parents hiding from me? Why am I beginning to realize that we both aren't who we thought we were? Elvira was silent. Each of her silences pressed on Pablo like a heavy stone. He felt her breathing become shallow as she began to move restlessly in place. You don't want me to start digging, do you? You already know what I can find. You want me to shut up so we can go back to this happy world we've built for ourselves, don't you? His voice became almost quiet, almost gentle, but the words sounded like a sentence. Silence. Then finally she spoke through. I feel something's wrong too. You're right. But don't ask me, Pablo. I can't answer you. You scare me too much. Those words echoed in his mind. He didn't know what to expect from his sister, but those words sounded like a revelation, like something long hidden. She couldn't answer. He realized that she too felt anxious, but was not ready to realize it. She was as afraid of the truth as he was. I can't just live with it. I have to know what really happened. Pablo made a decision after all. He had to find out the truth no matter what it took. He looked at the pictures, at the old papers, and saw the little details starting to come together into one picture. Pablo. Please? His sister's voice trembled again. It's not like you and I can change the past. We can't bring it all back. It's not that simple. We don't know the whole truth. And if you start looking for it, you can't go back. But Pablo couldn't stop himself. He felt that her words were an attempt to keep him from this path. She was trying to turn him away from what he might find. His sister's words seemed to freeze his thoughts, but he couldn't let them go. I know you and I can't go back in time. But I can't live a lie. I want to know who we really are and what's really going on between us. I can't hide my doubts anymore. You're hiding something from me, Elvira. I can feel it. The sister was silent again, but in her silence Pablo heard something that alerted him. He sensed that she was no longer trying to evade the conversation. And then she finally spoke. All right, Pablo. You're right. But know that you're not ready for the truth. We're all not ready. Maybe you'll find answers, but don't think they'll bring you relief. Sometimes the truth isn't what you need. But you want to know, don't you? Silence. Only Pablo's heart beat in his chest, echoing in his ears. Everything inside was breaking off, but he couldn't stop. He was on the threshold of something he couldn't understand, and he was ready to find out what this unknown truth was that would shatter everything he knew. Pablo wakes up in the middle of the night. The clock reads 3 o'clock and his room is immersed in dark, almost ominous shadows. He cannot sleep. Everything that has happened in the last few days swirls endlessly in his head like storm clouds. The anxiety won't let him go, he can feel it squeezing his chest, preventing him from breathing. But it's not just anxiety. It's a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and a premonition that something terrible is about to happen. He can't escape the thought that his world could shatter in an instant. He knew the answer was somewhere near, but this is the moment when all the edges of reality begin to crack. He couldn't predict. He gets out of bed, giving himself no time to think, and heads for the study. He pushes back his chair, opens his desk drawer and pulls out some papers. They are old papers he once saw. His hands are trembling. He doesn't realize what he's finding, but this moment, this unexpected turn has already begun. Pablo didn't know why he started looking for these particular documents, but now that he has them in his hands, he can't believe his eyes. Documents. Passports, birth certificates, photographs, records. So many years had passed and he'd never given them a second thought. Never paid attention to what these papers might be hiding. But now that he looks at them, he realizes, these are not just archives, they are real evidence of lies. He sees a last name. Another last name. He finds an entry that indicates that his sister is not his sister. Pablo feels his world crumbling. His eyes can't believe what they see. He moves his gaze from one document to another. At first it seems like a mistake, some ominous coincidence. But no, it's not a mistake. On each sheet is a name that wasn't in his life. His sister can't be his sister. She was someone else. At that moment his head goes blank. He doesn't realize what this means. All these years, all these memories, it's all just an illusion. What now? He can't stop reading these lines, repeating them in his head, trying to figure out exactly what happened. It's so disruptive to his world that he wants to just turn reality off, shut out everything, not perceive it. He thinks about his sister, her laughter, her innocence, how they grew up together. He thinks about how she was always there for him, how she was a part of his life, and now all those memories lose all meaning. He can't even imagine how she feels now that he finds this, when he realizes that her reality isn't his reality. He gets up and starts pacing around the room, not knowing what to make of this revelation. 1,000 thoughts swarm in his head. How is this possible? How could his parents keep something like this from him? Why didn't he notice anything? And what will happen to him now? Pablo feels everything around him disintegrate. It's not just a fact, it's a blow that shatters everything he's ever known. He can go back to his memories, but they are now colored with doubt. All those years spent with his sister now seem like lies. He can't trust anything he thought was his. His whole world has crumbled and all he is left with is a dark abyss with no support or safety. He feels his heart begin to beat faster. The pain, the fear, the confusion are all experiences he can't just ignore now. Pablo sits down on the edge of the bed, feeling his hands begin to shake. He tries to take a deep breath, but he can't. He can't calm himself down. This whole thing is a disaster. It's not just a loss of trust, it's an entire world shattered in an instant. He feels his world, his life that he was so sure of, begin to crumble like sand. When he looks at the documents, his gaze freezes. 1,000 scenes from the past flash through his mind. Flashes of memories that now seem strange to him. He'd seen through her eyes, experienced moments with her, and didn't know it was all fake. That she was someone else. In that moment, Pablo realizes that he is facing the most painful reality of all. His whole life, all his affection, all his love is not what he thought it was. He gets up again, his head buzzing like a raging ocean. He decides to talk to his parents. He has to know what happened. He has to get answers. They can't keep quiet. He won't let them just leave him in this horror. Why not? Pablo says it out loud as if to himself, as if he's trying to ask a question he can't get an answer to. Why didn't they tell me? Why have I lived this lie for so long? He throws the papers on the table and heads for his parents' room. Every step seems to give him a hard time. He doesn't know how to start this conversation, but he can't hold back. He can't keep quiet anymore. He feels his nerves stretched to the limit. There is only one thought in his mind. He must find out the truth. As soon as he walks into the room, his parents are sitting at the table. They don't expect him to show up. Pablo doesn't know how they will react, but it doesn't matter anymore. He can no longer hide, can no longer pretend that everything is the same. "Mom, Dad, I need to know," Pablo says, and in his voice you can hear the weight of what he's just learned. "Why isn't she my sister?" Silence. It's a moment when all the words that could have been said are frozen in the air. His mother looks at him with terror in her eyes. My father immediately turns away, and his face turns stony, as if he is ready to snap out of this nightmare. He doesn't want to answer, but he can't escape this reality. "Pablo, I beg you, don't ask these questions," his mother says, her voice shaking as if she can't hold back her tears. But Pablo can no longer stop. He demands the truth. Everything he's been through, everything they've hidden to him, now he needs to understand. He can't stay in the dark any longer. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" His voice becomes firmer, more desperate. The father stands up and walks off his seat. He can't look at his son. He can't look into Pablo's eyes, because he knows he no longer believes in this family fairy tale. "Because it was necessary," the father replies, his voice lifeless. "You weren't ready to know the truth. We all weren't ready. You can't understand what you had to do to keep it all from falling apart." Pablo feels his world crumbling again. He now realizes that he was part of some scary secret world that was never as he knew it. Everything around him becomes alien. Pablo sat in silence. Everything around him was engulfed in the darkness of the night, but a storm was raging in his head. He couldn't find a place for himself. The questions that kept running around in his head did not leave him for a moment. It seemed as if they were themselves becoming the very walls that were shrinking around his soul. Something inevitable was happening, something he couldn't escape. Even now that he finally knew the truth, he knew it was missing. He knew that the truth he had been so eager to find was only part of a much bigger one. Answers were at hand, but they didn't bring relief. This was not the end, just a new turn. He went back to the old documents, to the photographs, to the words he had once heard from his mother, from his father, from his sister. It didn't make sense that his life had turned out to be so far from what he had known before. Everything he thought was true was now a question. He felt that these little bits of information, these fragments of truth he had hoped for, would not be able to give him a completed answer. He wasn't ready to admit it, but each revelation only confirmed one thing: the world he lived in was built on hidden solutions, misunderstandings, and delusions. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a shift that touched his very existence. Sister. How strange that word sounded now. Like she was someone alien, someone who had entered his life but didn't belong. She was a part of history, but perhaps not the part that was written for him. He didn't know what to think. Her silence, her words, her fear, it all seemed now part of a plan he couldn't quite figure out. Why couldn't she answer? Why was she afraid of what seemed obvious? He couldn't believe she was so frighteningly defenseless in her doubts. Pablo knew they couldn't live a lie. But now he realized that sometimes the truth could be too difficult to accept at once. He could keep searching, endlessly striving for those answers that were so lacking. But what if he never found them? What if they remained closed, like deep wounds hidden in the dark corners of their family history? He decided not to look again. His decision didn't come immediately, but when it did, Pablo realized, the truth doesn't always save. There are times when knowledge that was supposed to be liberating turns into a heavy burden. He couldn't live with that burden any longer, but he couldn't give it up altogether either. He knew his life had changed. And that change was inevitable. But he couldn't afford to destroy all that was left, those moments that had filled his soul with joy, the love he had once believed in. He couldn't leave everything in the past, even if it meant he'd be left empty-handed. Instead of walking away in search of that truth that may never be completed, Pablo decided to return. But now that he was back, he knew things would be different. He wouldn't be able to go back to that world where there were no questions. He wouldn't be able to go back to being the man who knew no pain. But that was the only thing he could do: accept the unknown truth, accept that many questions remained unanswered, and live with what was now available to him. He picked up the old photograph again. He looked at it for a long time. That moment when he was still a carefree boy, seemed so distant to him now. He realized that it didn't matter who was in the picture, what was hidden behind that frame. All he knew were the moments he had lived, the memories that were now a part of him. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he would live in the future. Pablo took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't relive this story if he tried to unravel it to the end. He couldn't pull out everything that was hidden in the dark corners of their lives. And maybe that was best. Pablo had made a decision. He would go on with his life, knowing that some things must remain unspoken, that some mysteries would never be solved. He put the photograph back where it belonged, in the very box where it had been lying all along. And as he left the room, he felt these questions, though heavy, would no longer haunt him. He didn't know what had really happened, and he probably never would. But at least he could put that part of his life behind him. Pablo didn't know what the future held for him. But he knew one thing. Life would go on, and everything he had experienced would be part of who he would be. The truth remained hidden, but it didn't matter now. All he could do was live with what he had. And in that moment, as he looked at his family again, he realized that perhaps real strength lies not in looking for answers, but in being able to accept them when they come, even if they are not as we imagine them to be.